This has to be one of my favorite artworks I've ever done, and I'm going to show you exactly how to do it, because I know that drawing amazing character art can be hard and scary. When you see your favorite artist draw things like this or this, and all you can draw is this, you can get pretty discouraged. But still, you practice and practice and practice, and you still don't really like what you got. And you're afraid that you're never going to get better. But fear not, I'm going to share with you all my top secret techniques to help you draw stylized character art and improve as an artist. Let's get started. Tip 1. References. Gather references. And I know I always say this, I always start with this, but I don't understand why some young artists think it's cheating. Gather as many references as you can, as you want. I encourage you to gather multiple references for different parts of the artwork, like a face reference, lighting references, pose reference, and even style references. If you use only one reference and somebody else uses the same exact reference, then there's a big chance that both your artworks will look extremely similar. Tip 2. Start messy. Don't be afraid to sketch sloppily. When you're starting a piece, avoid getting caught up in the details too soon. It's important to stay loose with your lines and get a feel for overall composition before committing to something. Besides, some people are afraid of the blank canvas, so add some messy lines on there and it's no longer an empty canvas, and you have nothing to fear. What was that? Acting crazy out there, man. All this stress for only one subscriber? By sketching rough, you give yourself the freedom to experiment and explore ideas, different ideas. And I'm talking about getting really messy, like real messy, like puppy playtime messy. Who's going to clean this up? Don't worry about how messy it is. As long as you understand it, it doesn't matter. You can always clean it up later. Tip 3. Composition. Just because we are in the sketching phase doesn't mean you don't have to think of composition. In this one, I'm using the rule of thirds. Draw a 3x3 grid on your canvas, like this. The key idea of the rule of thirds is to place important elements of your composition in the intersection points of the grid. This helps you create a sense of balance and guides your eyes to the most important parts of the image. Our eyes naturally gravitate to these intersecting points, making them perfect places to put focal points. In my piece so far, you have the face close to this intersection. Then you have the hand, which is coming right at you, and I want that to be a focal point. And then in this one, you don't have anything, and that's okay. You don't have to put something in every intersecting point. So I'm going to put this strand of hair that kind of curves back at the character in this cool angle, which is another tip for composition. When you have something that points to something, then it kind of directs your eye in that direction. So it makes your eye go back to the character's face. It's another compositional trick. And in this intersection, you have the, never mind. Perverts. Another technique that I like to use is the golden ratio. The golden ratio is said to be visually appealing because it reflects patterns that we often see in nature, like in seashells, flower petals, even hurricane storms or galaxies have the golden ratio. You want your composition to follow this swirl of the golden ratio, with the focal point being at the end of that swirl, which is why I drew this scarf. Also, I want the character to use this scarf as a weapon, kind of like My Hero Academia's Mr. Aizawa. This scarf is also pointing at the character's face, which is the focal point. Tip 4. Inking. Turn down the opacity of your sketch layer and make a new layer and ink right on top of it. This time, you cannot be messy. You need to make sure that everything you do is methodic and has a purpose. You also want a variety of line weights. I tend to use thicker lines where I think there's going to be shadows, like underneath the chin, and thinner lines where I think there's going to be more light. Another inking technique is to have thicker lines on the outlines and thinner lines on the inside of the character. But you can pick and choose where to do this. Tip 5. Colors. For colors, it's easy to just go crazy and add all the colors in the whole world, but I kind of like keeping things in my artwork cohesive and together, and to help me do that, I like to keep a limited color palette. I use the same red in her gloves, in her skirt, and in her scarf. I then use contrasting colors for the colors of the hair and the color of her shirt, which I did kind of like a bluish teal color. And I know what you're thinking. Oh, but The complement of red is green. And I'm not talking about complementary colors like across the color wheel. Warm colors and cool colors also complement each other. Also, be sure to put your different colors into different layers because this helps you when rendering later. You don't have to worry about accidentally getting out of the lines when you use clipping masks. Tip 6. Framing. You want to frame your character in your canvas. It kind of helps everyone know what the focal point is, so you can use the background to do that. In this one, I use mountains in the background and also this bright sun around the character, framing her. You can do this with other elements as well, kind of like what I did with the scarf and what I did with this archway in this other drawing I did. Be sure to hit subscribe so you can see how I did that one later. And this brings me to tip number 7, backgrounds. Draw your background before you do any of your rendering. Drawing your background first helps show you and tell you where your light is going to be coming from, where your cast shadows are going to be, and how they will affect your character and your rendering. If you have a giant tree covering the sun, then you need to make sure that your rendering reflects that on your character. She's going to be in shade. Maybe little beams of light coming through the gaps in the leaves. Or if you end up drawing the sun on the right side of your character, then why is the light coming from the left side of your character? Drawing your background first tells you where your lighting source is going to be. And I know drawing backgrounds can be scary, but as you can see here in this one, for the sky, I just drew swirly lines and I painted and I painted and I painted until I kind of liked what it looked like. It doesn't have to be super realistic. I was going for more of a comic book feel for this one. Bonus tip, take a break. It's important to take a break. It's important for your mind and your body. You don't want to be hunched over your art tablet too long, looking like a giant shrimp. It can be bad and hurt your back and neck, and you also want to step away from your piece because when you come back to it, you might notice things that you didn't notice when you were staring at it for so long. You tend to notice your mistakes. Go outside, touch some grass, walk your dogs, eat a cookie or 10, and then it's time to go back to work. Tip 8, the soft brush. Now this might be a little bit controversial. I know a lot of artists tell you to avoid rendering with your soft brush, but I completely disagree. Now, if you use it wrong, it can make your artwork appear muddy and kinda mess up your rendering. It can look weird. But if you do it correctly, it helps you in your rendering. It can be pretty scary to have an artwork that you love and then have to start rendering the piece and you're afraid to mess it up. So I make my soft brush really big and I drop in those shadows where I think the shadows are going to be. Then I lower the opacity so that it is barely noticeable, and this takes away that muddy look. That soft shadow now can help guide you in where to put your hard shadows. I put my hard shadows on a new layer, remembering to turn on those clipping masks so I don't have to worry about getting out of the lines. But this time I use a smaller brush and I'm a little bit more deliberate in where I put my shadows. Now the soft shadow underneath the hard shadow, they kind of work together to make a more natural looking rendering. But for me, I like cell shading, as well as a more painterly look. I add another layer, setting the style of that layer to multiply. Then I bring down the opacity to about 50. I draw another layer of shadows within the shadows that I already have, trying not to overlap them too much. This gives that cell shaded look. You can also use a soft eraser brush to make it less prominent. And then I do the same exact thing for the light. Use a big soft brush at first and then a smaller hard brush, kind of getting layers stacked on top of each other. Let me know in the comments down below if you want me to go into more detail about my rendering process. It's my favorite part of the artwork. But moving on to tip 9, experiment. When I'm working on a new piece, I like to experiment with different things. And in this one, I decided to use a different brush. When I'm doing my rendering, I use a texture brush on the shirt to show that it's more of a fabric, and on the scarf as well. Now, when you're doing this, you may not like what you have done in this experiment. You might never want to try it again, but you might find something that you absolutely love. So make sure you separate this into another layer so that if you don't like it, you can just delete it and start over. But part of being an artist, part of drawing, is experimenting. You're a mad scientist. And speaking of textured brushes, speaking of texture, tip 10 is to add textures. Using textured brushes is not the only option you have to add textures. You can also add textures that you find online. When you finish your rendering in a particular section, then you can try adding some texture. In this case, I put it all over where my red colors are, and I set the layer style to overlay. And I lowered that opacity. Lowering the opacity gives you more control of what you can and cannot see in that texture. you want to lower that intensity a little bit. You can also use just certain parts of that texture, like I did in this one. I used Photoshop to select the specific color of this rock texture, then I deleted the rest of the texture. Then I used it on the mountains that I have in the background. Adds a little bit of grit to my mountain. And this is a perfect segue to the next tip, photo bashing. Don't be afraid to use photos and stock images that you find online in your drawing as well. I found these ruins that I want to have on the top of the mountain, and using Photoshop, I deleted the backgrounds and I put them in my drawing. And I also used this filter gallery cutout on them. This gives them more of a comic booky feel. It's a good filter to use. Also, make sure that those things that you added using photo bashing match your artwork. In this case, you need to do some color matching. A simple way to do color matching is to take a color from the background, in this case, our sky. I used orange, and then use a transparent to that orange gradients, and then put it over the buildings, using a clipping mask on those buildings as well. And now it kind of matches your environment. Tip 12 is something that I like to call highlights. It stands for awesome highlights. Whoops, I can't say that second A on YouTube, but it means the same thing as booty, but it starts with an A. You know what I'm talking about. Add in those juicy highlights and it makes a world of difference. I usually add them to the eyes, the lips, and to the tip of the nose. They make you just go, ah. Tip 13, add depth. Adding depth to your image makes it look more dynamic, and there's an easy way to do this. Simply add objects to your foreground, like bushes or rocks or dragonflies or whatever it is that you want. Blur it out using a Gaussian blur. It makes it look and appear out of focus, like it's way in front of your character. And we're focusing on your character, so everything else is blurry. I also like to add sparks to my image depending on the feel and the mood of the image, of course, but adding those sparks makes it look cooler. You use the sparks that you find using some photo bashing, and this adds some depth as well. Just make sure you put that spark layer in screen layer mode and it gets rid of the black background. Tip 14, coloring your lines. Use a clipping mask above your ink layer and change the colors of those black lines to match the character. If you want to keep those black lines, then that is completely up to you. But me and my style, I like to have less harsh, dark lines. So I want to change the line color. I select the color that's closest to the line, darken it, and raise the saturation just a little bit. And then I color in that line. It matches what's inside of the lines, but you can still see the line. And in some cases, I don't want to see that line. I want to make my artwork appear like lineless art, more like a painting. So I use the exact same color that's next to the line, which means I have to keep selecting the color and then painting, and then selecting the color and painting, and selecting the color and painting. It's very annoying. It can be very tedious and it takes a while, but I love the results. So make sure you zoom in and get those black lines colored in. Tip 15, add your finishing touches. Now I know that can mean a lot of things. It can be a lot of different tips, but I'm just gonna put them into one category. I tend to do all these things at the end of my drawing, at the end of my artwork. For instance, I like to add more of a graphic look to my drawing, so I add some halftones to the image and some cross-hatching. This gives me more of a pop art feel. I also like to add some color dodge. It makes things brighter, adding more light. I also like to add a rim light to the edges of the character. With the intense lighting source coming from behind my character, there's going to be some rim light around her, and I absolutely love rim light. It helps separate the character from the background. I also tend to add a vignette and a lens flare to my piece, but not all the time. Also, this is a big one and it's very subtle, but I add strands of hair to my character. I don't know why, but it makes the world of a difference. So I finished my artwork and wow, that looks great using my tips. It looks awesome, I think. And if you want to see me use these tips to make some awesome product mascots for things like Mr. Beast Feastables or Prime by KSI and Logan Paul, then you can watch this video right here. I love the way these came out, and I'll see you there. What the heck was that? Acting crazy out there, man.